welcome, and so nice to have all of you here. I was very interested because I've got this really cool remote, and it allows you to do very funky things. And then I realized my presentation is all in black, and it actually doesn't work on a black screen. So unfortunately, I can't use it. But what we are going to do is really have nice conversations around the idea of what systems thinking is, how complexity works. And I'm going to hope that this is a little bit more of an interactive conversation rather than me speaking. But really, what we want to do is look at the evolution of business architecture from a business strategy perspective and understand it from how we can think about complexity and how we can use that to turn strategy into action. Um, by a show of hands, who have you had a transformation or initiative that came and completely disrupted something that you were doing, like just like in general? Um, you're working on a project and it got completely canceled and you had to move on to other things. Not too many people. That's good. At least a few people. But there's this, when we think about this quote by Peter Hinson, who's like an innovation author, he talks about this idea of never normal. We're in a time and a place where things are just fundamentally changing at a rapid pace. So we think about all the geopolitical challenges that we have, the environmental challenges, the ecological challenges, and particularly the technological challenges that are happening, particularly with the advent of AI. And I remember this lovely quote by Justin Trudeau when he said, the pace of change has never been this fast and it will never be this slow again. And I love that quote because it seems to be coming into fruition more and more and more, right? And I think we all see it with the advent of AI. It just gets super fast and really quick. And it's difficult to keep up to date with the pace of change. And Ray Kurzweil, who is a technologist and author, he kind of looked at it and he called it the law of accelerating returns. And what he says is that we use new computers to design even faster new computers, and that creates a positive feedback loop that accelerates our acceleration. Like it's pretty cool when you think about it like that. And he did some maths, and what he said is that we're going to experience 20,000 years of technological change in the next 100 years. Um, and like I saw an interesting video today around one of the companies that are doing chip designs, Huawei. And Huawei has looked at Moore's law, and effectively, when we think about transistors, they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, so we can fit more on a chip. And then what happened is the US government said, no, we're not going to sell any of this materials to Huawei. And they had to rethink this design. And all they did is they layered chips over each other. So they realized it's not about the size of the chips, it's how the chips communicate with each other. So that you got a 58% yield in terms of increase, in terms of your chip density and what you can deliver on that chip. So Moore's law is completely broken, which is like this idea of constantly innovating around faster and more transistors on a single chip. So I think when we think about all these changes that are happening, it's just incredible that we are going to experience this massive amount of change really quickly. So who's heard of the term VUCA? What does it mean? Any guesses? All right. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So what's interesting about VUCA was that it came about in the 1980s by the US Army. And the US Army used this idea of VUCA to really understand the global shifts that are happening and to navigate these global shifts in the environment. Um, but what's happened is we've actually moved from the 1980s to where we are today. And while VUCA still remains relatively relevant, there's new concepts that have come up, the one being BANI. And BANI stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. Right. So when we think about the idea of brittle, it's like if you think about a brick, it's quite hard and strong, but if you throw it against the ground, it can shatter. There's lots of ideas and concepts around where things are brittle as well. So another good example that I use is a twig. If you have a twig that's really dry and you bend it and it will likely snap, but if you've got some moisture in it and it's a little bit flexible, then it just flexes, right? So if I ask you from an organizational perspective, where do you think things are quite rigid and brittle? Who's got some ideas? around how organizations can be a little bit brittle. If you think about your organization as an example, any ideas? Go for it. Right. You take one person out, everything breaks. You kind of have to relook at the environment completely, right? And like that. Any others? Cash flow, absolutely. Change that dynamic, and it's not fluid quite easily. Um, Legacy systems are quite rigid, right? You put more transactions through those systems, and they tend to break. So that becomes a little bit challenging. Rigid strategies. So you put a strategy in place, and you expect to deliver on that strategy, and the world changes, and then you can't necessarily deliver on those strategies. So there's a lot of rigid processes within businesses, and that kind of create this idea of brittle societies. And with brittleness, first things break. Um, we have to design differently in that environment. So, how would you think, like in a brittle environment, we design organizations differently? What would you do? Any ideas? So, most organizations have gone through some level of a transformation from an agile perspective. So, design with flexibility in mind, right? Make sure that when you put your teams together, that there's teams that flow to work, there's teams that are able to navigate complexity a little bit more, so that you don't break the system. So, a lot of when we think about a brittle organization, the way we compensate for that is to design with a little bit more flexibility. Anxious organizations. So when organizations are a little bit more anxious, they tend to be a little bit less innovative. They lead to some level of fear, and that anxiety and fear leads to a little bit more of um, paralysis from a decision-making perspective, right? So you're a little bit more a little bit more afraid to make big decisions, particularly where the environment is a little bit more anxious. And particularly when we think about where the world is today, making decisions is really, really, really hard because you just don't know what's going to happen, even like a few months from now, let alone few years from now. So again, when you think about anxious businesses, how do you compensate for anxious businesses? How do you design the way we do work in anxious businesses? Any ideas? Failures, yeah. Absolutely. Yes, and then how do you harness for that idea of failure? What type of tools do you use, and how do you think about that? Fail fast. Hmm. Culture. So you need to shift culture. Um, so fail forward, all the things that we're talking about is really creating a culture of experimentation, right? Because what happens is what I like about experiments is that instead of saying that this is going to work or not going to work and we failed, you just say, this is a hypothesis. We think that this is going to happen if we do this and this and this. If it doesn't happen, our hypothesis is not true. It's not that we have failed, it's just our hypothesis was not true. So again, in a very anxious society, what we want to do is we want to build things really small. We want to test and put it down and iterate. And when we do more of that, we break the cycle of anxiety in organizations. Um, Non-linear is effectively saying, you know, traditionally there was A to B, cause and effect. Non-linear is now you make a change in a system, and if all things go wrong on every other system, it's a lot more difficult to understand what you're doing now and what the impact is further. And we'll talk about that and how it looks like from a wicked problem a little bit later. Um, and then finally, incomprehensibility. Like we live in a world where there's so much information, we just can't actually comprehend. If you look at a business process and you change a business, we don't have all the information at our disposal and at our fingertips to make effective decisions. So, like in very in environments where things are a lot more incomprehensible, it is our jobs to create clarity and give direction in terms of what we need to do, because we can't necessarily focus on everything. It's just too much information. So this is a nice lens to kind of think about your organization and have workshops around how we think about what we do and how we show up in terms of making strategic decisions. Um, Besides all of that, we also think about Bani as adaptive. So it's complex and adaptive. It continuously changes, right? It's not just a singular view and it's a snapshot in time. The world consistently changes. And that leads me to this idea of wicked problems. Like, so what is a wicked problem? Any idea? So it's a problem where there's no definitive answer. It's a challenge for business leaders to really understand this problem. And when we think about these in businesses, it's about politics, how we do big things, the multiple dynamics that are happening, particularly if you're doing big digital transformations across an entire organization. And that brings a mix of threats and opportunities, right? So it's not just this is a problem and we fix it. It, like you said, it leads to other challenges. Everything continuously changes. And then like the implementation of solutions bring new problems. So if you look at it like this, there's an input, and then things happen, right? And eventually there's multiple outputs. So before, in simple problems, there's a problem, and then the problem leads to a solution. Very simple, and even maybe with a more complicated type problem, you can still lead to that. But with complexity, we just need to really unpack this. And you can't solve a problem, a wicked problem, but what you can do is you can navigate it. Because in complex problems, your problem leads to a solution, which leads to more problems, which leads to more solutions, and this thing continues. So you have to navigate wicked problems. Um, and this kind of is all in a world that's fundamentally changing, and there's a number of factors that and dynamics that are demanding business change. So if you're in your organization today, what are some of the factors that are forcing you to change in terms of how you think about the way you deliver and execute on your strategies? What are some of those things? And they're fairly generic. So any ideas? Technology being one, impatience of customers, so the customer needs and demands, that whole changing customer landscape. What else? Legislation and regulatory is competition is fundamentally a big driver of change. Anything else? Geopolitics. Yeah, I didn't even need to put a presentation up because you guys said all of it. Which is why I like these things, right? So you talked about customer needs fundamentally shifting, right? Customers demanding more things like hyper personalization, digital first technologies, technology disruption around AI and automation. How are we thinking about that, particularly from our organizations? We've got all the economic and regulatory pressures, economic pressures from a cost efficiency and trying to make the most of what we have go as far as possible. All the workforce shifts, so how does AI really impact our workforce? What are we doing about those things? You've got all the risk and resilience, so things around cyber threats and security and supply chain failures if you're in manufacturing. And then the economy it just is a very challenged economy today. Higher inflation, rising oil prices, all those things. So how do we kind of allow for us to make better decisions in these spaces? And like I said, with wicked problems and in complexity, the crux of the challenge is not to avoid these things, but really to embrace it and navigate it. Um, and I like this quote from Peter Drucker that says the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not turbulence itself, but it's really to act with yesterday's logic, right? So when we think about these things and we think about systems, we have very conventional thinking. But with in today, we need to think about things slightly differently. So we apply a lens of systems thinking. And what I've done is I've kind of looked at the difference between what conventional thinking is and what systems thinking is, right? So in conventional thinking, we think about things in isolated parts. We break things down and we think about those parts as individual components. While that's really good to start making sense of the thing, what we do need to do is think in wholes. We need to think about if we make a change here, what is the impact in the rest of the organization? How do we optimize for the bigger organization? And I know from an all mutual perspective, as an example, um, we busy um, uh, we're busy reorganizing to allow our various business units to have a lot more autonomy in terms of how they deliver, which is all good because you want that speed of delivery. But there are certain things, like especially as enterprise architects, that we look at from an organizational perspective. We need to think in wholes rather than in our isolated businesses, because we need someone bring all these things together. So for us as enterprise architects, it's really important to think about things from a whole perspective. Um, in traditional thinking, we think about things in components, like this and this and this and this, and we're not understanding, again, how these things are interconnected. So besides just thinking about it from a component perspective, we need to sense make and understand how all of these things are interconnected a little bit better. We talked about linear, so cause and effect. And I think especially a lot of technologists are really good at that, right? Because it's very logical. If this happens, then that happens, else this happens. But uh, when we apply a lens of systems thinking, we think about things non-linear in a way. So like we do need to think about it in terms of systems and causal loop diagrams, and understanding how a change in one place may have an impact in a change in another place. And we need to visualize these things. Um, and then again, traditionally, we always think about decomposing things in a reductionist manner, right? But that's always difficult to do, because if you think about, like, say, a bee and honey, right? If you try to decompose honey, it looks at, you need a bee and you need pollen, but you can't really say honey is made of bee and pollen. Honey is honey, right? You can't decompose it easily. So again, we have to, and particularly in businesses, because things are so complex, it's not like if you do this and you do this, you're going to get a definitive answer. You're going to have a multitude of different answers. So we have to think in terms of emergence rather than reductionist thinking. And then again, we were very good at analyzing things, right? We had lots of business analysts come in and analyze what we need to do. But I think we need to get better at synthesis. So synthesis is around analysis, but with some level of intellect and insights that are born out of that. And then just a little bit from a strategy perspective as well. I think we have this evolving approach from a strategy perspective, right? So we always used to think about strategy like a game of chess, right? And chess is very much around tactics. You look at two or three moves ahead. It's also very it's based on like attrition, and you annihilate the opponent, right? It's me against you. We're going to kill you. And the thing is about chess is it's a really good business model if you are in a very defined business where you have a fixed amount of resources. You don't necessarily have a lot of competitors. This is a great business model, like an analogy to think about. And each piece has a hierarchy. So your queen is the most with a 9, and then your other pieces kind of go down in terms of value, with your pawns being a 1. So you think about each piece as individuals and a hierarchy. And that leads to a little bit more of a command and control organization. What I like to think about is rather the idea of the ancient Chinese board game, which is Go. And what Go is, it's a 19 by 19 grid. And the idea behind Go is it's a lot more decentralized. So it's all about gaining territory. Each piece is all equal. So there's no difference between piece value. But it's all about how do you think about gaining the most amount of territory. And if we think about it from our customer's perspective, it's a similar concept, right? We in this model, it's a lot more agile. It's a lot more strategic. There's a lot more moves in Go than there are in chess. And it's a lot more decentralized. So we kind of make longer term decisions rather than short term decisions. It's more strategic rather than tactical. And it's quite dynamic. It changes quite considerably. And the best way to kind of also articulate this is, does anyone know what this is? Which is a really cool computer. Give you a clue, I was working here. Yes, Deep Blue, well done. Yeah, so Deep Blue is a really cool computer, and it fundamentally changed the idea of AI. So at the time in the 1990s or so, um, people used to think about computers as these big mainframes that do very particular work like payrolls and so forth. And then eventually, and this is a great book, by the way, Deep Thinking by Gary Kasparov, and it talks about where AI ends and creativity begins. And I really quite liked it. That got me into chess. Uh, but what Gary Kasparov talks about in this book is that it ran a number of games, and Deep Blue actually lost against Gary Kasparov in this instance. But then what IBM did is it created Deep Blue, and it said, we're actually going to make a whole lot of changes. And what in a year or so later, Deep Blue actually beat Gary Kasparov with a score of 3.5 to 2.5. But what I found really interesting about the story was that when Deep Blue had won Gary Kasparov asked IBM for a rematch, and IBM completely terminated the whole Deep Blue program, which was quite fascinating. So they weren't willing to have a follow-on match. But in a similar vein, and this is a couple of years later, AlphaGo was created. And the difference between chess and Go as a board game is it's a lot more complex. So you can't, in chess, you can say these are some decision rules. This is how you do it. It's basically a very big decision tree based on numbers and hierarchies. But what deep-minded is it really took neural networks to another level, right? And it's really complicated because in chess there's only 20 moves, but in Go there's 200 moves, which if you kind of look at it, there's more possible positions in Go than there are atoms in the universe. So you can't program for this easily. You have to use machine learning to understand how the game works, to learn and play against itself, and then continuously play. And they challenged the best Go player at the time, Lee Sedol, and what was interesting is when the game started, Lee Sedol seemed to have been winning the game, but then the AlphaGo made a very weird move, and Lee Sedol was like, "No, that move doesn't make sense to me. It can't be. This game is going to lose." And it completely reinvented the way, um, reinvented the game with completely different moves. And we always think about like AI as a hallucination and it's doing the wrong things, but it's just being creative, right? I think hallucinations are actually being creative. So we must sort of embrace some level of hallucination from AI because that's how we can get better insights from it. Um, so we kind of think about this gap as, okay, so we've got a strategy, we need to deliver it, but it is difficult to deliver. And this gap is because we struggle to deliver and execute on strategy. There's lots of siloed thinking with a lot of people that have vested interests. There's a lot of unintended impacts from something like delivering on strategy. We don't know what's going to happen, so those unintended consequences are there, and it always leads to some level of unplanned action and delays. And that kind of brings me to a little bit around business architecture. So we talked about, what the challenges are, how we understand the changing environment, how systems thinking work. And all I did is I kind of said, how does this apply from a business architecture or an enterprise architecture perspective? So when we think about it from a whole's perspective, business architecture looks at the entire enterprise as a whole system through value chains, value streams, integrated capabilities, customer journeys, not singular siloed views of an organization. So it really allows us to up our thinking in terms of how we look at the whole organization. It also looks at connections. So we use capabilities, business capabilities, as a connection to from our strategy to how we deliver. And those capabilities become a consistent way in how we deliver on our strategy, as well as on like linking our initiatives, our applications, our processes through to those capabilities. When we think about things from a non-linear perspective, we understand as leaders that small changes in capability shifts can lead to large impacts later on, right? So we do understand as architects that if we make a small change, it can have big impacts later on. And we do things like understanding what the strategic levers are in organizations, having conversations around what those levers could be that will allow us to have bigger changes and shifts later on. From an emergence perspective, We help create those ecosystems between our partners and the rest of the organization. We make visible new patterns by documenting all through all our lovely notations like BPMN and DMN. Like we make the organization visible, um, and helps it helps leaders make sense of the organization. And then finally, we help synthesize strategy. So we decompose strategy into something a little bit more digestible. And we use lots of really nice tools to do that. Things like our business model canvases, things like our value stream mapping. And I think I've put a little bit of a slide together around what this could look like, right? So there's a lot of components that we look at that really communicate the strategic direction and strategy development. So we've got our value network models, we've got our value chains, our business innovation models, a lot of our strategy maps that we create, and that general strategic synthesis. And then we kind of look at the components that represent and inform execution. So things like our business model canvases, our value proposition canvases, things around operating models and how we start taking that and designing it so that we can deliver more effectively. And then it leads into the actual delivery space around our value streams, business processes, and initiatives. And all of it is hinged into our capabilities that kind of speak to our organizational portfolio. And there's a whole lot of other systems thinking tools like iceberg models and so forth that we can leverage to help make sense of organizations. And like always, good to end with a quote. So this is a quote by Herbert Simon, who's a scholar that influenced a lot of fields from computer science to economics and psychology. But he says engineering, medicine, business, architecture, and painting are all really concerned with the necessary, but not with the contingent. And it's not how things are done, but how they should be. And in short, that's really with design. So we have to design better organizations into the future.